Hello and welcome from me, David Foster. The diplomatic deal between two Gulf Arab states and Israel is at the very least something new in a Middle East that appears perpetually locked in a cycle of violence and recrimination. But what actually made Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates want to be friends with a very old enemy? And who might follow? This is Roundtable. United against Iran trade. Two possible reasons for the recent White House signing. Though, has Israel changed in any way? Absolutely not, say Palestinians who say they feel abandoned. So, what is causing a change of heart in at least one part of the Arab world?
A historic day to some, a betrayal to others. The signing of an agreement between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Israel means a change in the Middle East. For decades, the Arab world was united behind a policy towards Israel. There will be no normal relations with us, they said, until there is peace with the Palestinians. But now, two of those Gulf nations have agreed to a new relationship with Israel. And for the Palestinians, a tide may be turning. If Israel was once isolated in the Middle East, now the Palestinians may fear they are being left behind. A lot may depend on what other countries do next.
Well, very pleased to say that we can welcome once again to the round table James Watt, former British diplomat, ambassador at one stage to Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt. We go to Washington, D.C. to say hello to Giorgio Cafiero, Chief Exec of Gulf State Analytics. That's a Washington, D.C. based geopolitical risk consulting firm which looks at risks and opportunities in the Gulf. And there's Dr. Ian Black joining us from London, visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Centre, that is at the London School of Economics. As we record this, we've had a news flash which says that Palestine quitting the Arab League role in protest over Israel deals. It was to have chaired meetings for the next few months. The foreign minister says, we're not interested. This is a rather small protest, isn't it, from a group that appears to have been sidelined, particularly by the Arab League, that said, we're not interested in your complaints about what deals Bahrain and the UAE are doing with Israel. James, you want to come in on that one first?
Yes, I agree. It's a small protest, it's a gesture, but also I think there's a practical value there because the Arab League have got to discuss the question of the future of Palestine, the future response collectively to the moves made recently. And it's a good thing not to have the main protagonist in the chair at that point. So I think there's a practical reason too.
Ian, what do you make of it?
Well, it's largely symbolic, isn't it? I agree with James that there are practical implications. But I think it does show the degree of Palestinian anger at what the UAE and Bahrain have done, and in effect supported by the Arab League. It's an important moment in the Arab consensus, if you like, long-standing consensus, to how to support the Palestinians. It's really quite a significant moment in that story.
Giorgio, I will come to you in just a moment, but I want to go back to James on this one. Given the fact that Qatar and Algeria have now lodged protests, there have been street protests in Morocco, the number of countries condemning it has grown. Why would these two Gulf countries decide to do this right now?
Well, I think everybody is trying to find a way forward, and there must be some quite complex motives behind this move and then the timing of it. The broader context is that the United Arab Emirates would like to play a bigger diplomatic role in the region, and it indeed has been, including, for example, in military terms, actually, in Yemen and Libya, for example. But also, UAE has relations with Damascus, for example, it has relations with Iran, a security relationship to keep things moving in the Gulf. So I see it as part of a wider aim of the UAE government to acquire a diplomatic role which is capable of speaking to all parties openly and actually trying to propel things along.
Giorgio, let me bring you in here. What interest does it serve for the two Gulf countries?
You know, there are many interests in play at many different levels. When it comes to the U.S. factor, which is of course important, I think Abu Dhabi and Manama want to play their cards to help Trump, because these two countries are very nervous about what would happen if Joe Biden wins this election. This is also about boosting their PR images in Washington. At the same time, there are geopolitical concerns in the picture. For Bahrain, the perspective is that Iran poses this existential threat. UAE also sees Iran as a danger, but the UAE is also very ambitious in the Mediterranean. Abu Dhabi is also very determined to counter Ankara's foreign policy, and this is very important, the Turkish factor, in understanding why Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv signed this diplomatic agreement. At the same time, there are many issues that just have to do simply with economics and also the tech sector. Israel is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. It's a very prosperous country. It has state-of-the-art port infrastructure, and the Emiratis are definitely looking to benefit from deals signed with Israel in domains such as technology, investment, commerce, tourism, so on and so forth.
Ian, can we go into some of what Giorgio's just said there, the concerns that if Joe Biden won the election? Do you follow that argument?
Well, of course, Joe Biden was vice president under Barack Obama, of course, and that's an association, of course, with the Obama administration that Gulf countries, and particularly the ones we're talking about, don't like. They prefer Trump. There's no question about that. I think that they certainly wanted to deliver something to Trump in advance of the November presidential election. But I think that maybe they're concerned about Biden, but I don't think that Biden is going to row back on support for the improvement of Israel's relations with Arab states. I think the larger question is about Saudi Arabia, actually, which has so far refrained from taking part in this normalization process. But I do think that the Saudis must be worried more about a Biden presidency in terms of their, record on the Khashoggi affair, and of course their intervention in Yemen, and their general regional ambitions.
Yeah.
Of course, what brings the sides together is common hostility to Iran, and of course Biden has pledged to restore or to revive, if you like, the 2015 agreement, which Trump walked away from.
We'll come to Saudi Arabia and the interesting question of whether it will be the Crown Prince who might want to normalize relations with Israel rather than the king a little bit later, if we may, in the program. But James, I want to ask you about the Iranian threat. What could Israel expect from Bahrain, the UAE? Saudi Arabia is a different matter. If there were hostilities with Iran, if it needed to put a common Middle Eastern face on opposition to Iran, what does Israel get out of this?
I mean, I find it very unlikely that any country would like to be in the front line of a war with Iran, and literally in the front line in the case of UAE and Bahrain. They've got so much to lose, and I don't think there's any realistic prospect of them contributing to a military alliance against Iran, except very defensively.
So what do they give to Israel?
I think it's the political credit, isn't it? I think there's a deep, a long-standing wish on the part of Israelis to be accepted in the region and to feel that they're not a pariah state in the region. And every time there's a step like this, which there was, of course, previously with Egypt and Jordan, they feel a little less isolated, a little less vulnerable. So it's a lot of psychology involved here rather than practicality.
James, what sort of difference do any peace treaties ever make? Because, of course, we've seen them with Jordan and we've seen them with Egypt, and you've studied both of those countries from the inside.
Jordan gained a lot. It gained the ability to spend less on defense and concentrate on investment, to encourage, again, sort of normalization of its role. It also, by signing the peace treaty with Israel, was able to open up the West Bank to more normal communication. Egypt, of course, got the return of the Sinai and a lot of goodwill in Washington, as Jordan did. So there were several benefits to signing those peace treaties, although I'm the first to agree that it's not a warm peace in the sense that the populations of both Jordan and Egypt are not enthusiastic about.
Yes, I mean, it was described, as you just referenced, as a cold peace, in fact. So, Giorgio, my question to you is, if those treaties still in existence achieved something initially, have they changed anything down the road? Will this deal with Bahrain and the UAE change anything long term?
When we're talking about the geopolitical implications of the Abraham Accords, I think there's a real risk to both overstating as well as understating the significance. To be sure, the accords that the UAE and Bahrain signed with Israel cannot really be compared to the ones which Egypt and Jordan signed in the previous century. Bahrain and the UAE are not neighbors of Israel, and there's never been hostility between these two Gulf states and Israel. So the context and the motivations are very, very different. That being said, I do think that these peace accords will be important, not in the sense that they are going to fundamentally alter the Middle East's geopolitical order, but what I think they will do is serve to institutionalize and formalize geopolitical fault lines in the region. And also, we need to keep in mind that the UAE is a powerful force in the Arab region. It also has a lot of clout in Africa, and it is a country that tries to always lead on geopolitical issues. And I think we could see numerous other countries in possibly in the Gulf, but I think more likely in the Sahel and the Maghreb follow in Abu Dhabi's footsteps. And this will ultimately lead to somewhat more of an Israeli integration into the wider Islamic world's diplomatic fold.
I'll throw that one to you, Ian. Giorgio mentioned countries in the Sahel region, northern and western Africa. Which countries do you think might follow the lead of the UAE and Bahrain?
Well, there's a lot of speculation about Sudan that might follow. The Americans are obviously encouraging Khartoum to follow suit. Of course, Israel has had long-standing relations dating back many decades with Morocco. That's another candidate potentially, but the key, I think, is Saudi Arabia. Actually, it's such an important country, a regional power. Its legitimacy is based to a great extent on its custodianship of the holy places of Mecca and Medina, and I think that is the key country. If Sudan were to follow, or Morocco were to follow, that would be fine, and it would certainly serve the Israeli agenda, which is pretty bipartisan, I have to say, of establishing normal relations with Arab and Muslim countries. But Saudi Arabia,
can I just wonder if Bahrain and the UAE, therefore, and possibly Sudan, are being thrown onto the fishing grounds, rather like chum, just to see what is below the surface, and Saudi Arabia's watching to see what might happen?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that for example, the Bahrainis would not, in my view, have acted as they did without some kind of approval, obviously privately, from the Saudis. It's an important regional neighbor. The relationship is clearly, important one way rather than the other. And I don't think that this would have happened. It's arguably true of the UAE as well, but of course, part of this story is the particularly assertive foreign and security policies that we've got used to in recent times from Abu Dhabi.
Giorgio, I noticed that you said that in the notes I was given, that Saudi, you believe, will be cautiously following this and slowly following this. How long before it assesses whether, in fact, a deal between itself and Israel is a possibility?
This is the question on the minds of so many Middle East analysts right now. Would Saudi Arabia sign its own diplomatic accord with Israel? I want to premise this by saying this is 2020, and there are a lot of bizarre things that have happened this year that we have not been able to predict. So we have to keep in mind that really anything is possible. There certainly could be a peace accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but I think Riyadh is going to move cautiously, and I think officials in Saudi Arabia want to see how the Abraham Accords pan out throughout the region. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that every Arab state which is considering a diplomatic accord with Israel has to weigh the costs and benefits carefully. For Saudi Arabia, the assessment is very different than it is in the smaller 5 GCC states because of Saudi Arabia's large geography, its much larger population, also its role as a leader in the Islamic world. These are all variables that are unique to the equation in Saudi Arabia. At a time of low oil prices, unresolved war in Yemen, COVID-19 crisis, the Saudi leadership does not want to make some moves in the region that could trigger some unrest within the kingdom. Some experts have even opined that a clerical revolt in Saudi Arabia is a real risk that the rulers in Riyadh would have to consider. But regardless of whether or not Saudi Arabia signs a deal with Israel to formalize the bilateral relations, we all know that the Saudis and Israelis coordinate on a host of issues. This is not new. This has been going on for many years. And I think the Saudis are going to try to use the official relations between Bahrain, UAE on one side, and Israel on the other to its advantage. I think the Saudis will see Bahrain and the UAE as 2 hubs within the Gulf that will be able to facilitate greater dialogue, cooperation, and coordination between Saudi Arabia and the Israelis.
Yeah, so they are perhaps the outliers. As a former diplomat, James, I want to ask you your assessment of, if there were ever to be a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, where that would stand on the scale of what we saw between Jordan, what we saw between Egypt and Israel, and what we've seen in the last week or so. It would be colossal, wouldn't it?
I think it would be colossal in tilting the whole of Arab diplomacy towards accepting relations with Israel without any countervailing settlement for the Palestinians, unless the Saudis decide to try to extract more conditionality from the Israelis in return for their move, which doesn't look particularly likely at the moment. I think the underlying problem here is that not only is public opinion very skeptical and hostile perhaps to this, but none of it is actually going to end up solving the long-running and destabilizing problem in the region of the unsettled question of Palestinian rights.
So may I just read this to you from the New York Times, which I picked up on today. The deal, it says, was a diplomatic coup for Israel, but it ruptured decades of professed Arab unity around the Palestinian cause. It swapped one Palestinian nightmare, annexation, which many world leaders had warned would be an illegal land grab. That's been put to the side, I must say, for the moment, for another, perhaps even bleaker prospect of not being counted at all. Is that where it leaves the Palestinians?
Yes, and I think what we've ended up is no progress towards a two-state solution and no progress towards a one-state solution. But what we've got is this suspended animation, kind of the prospect of maybe keeping alive the two-state solution, which is actually exactly what Mr. Kushner said about this. It's a great deal for Israel because it keeps alive the two-state solution. But of course, it doesn't lead to the two-state solution. It means that the present paralysis and failure to resolve this very, very deep and historic issue is again being kicked down the road. And that's what I find sort of unhistoric about the present developments. They're not going to solve that. They are, yes, they're changes in the diplomatic chessboard, and that'll have important consequences, particularly in terms of regional security. But for me, it doesn't tackle the really underlying problem.
So, Ian, why would Bahrain and the UAE, and by extension the countries you've mentioned, Morocco, Sudan, I also have on my list Mauritania and Oman, why would they effectively throw the Palestinians to the wolves?
Well, I think that you could say in the big picture that those countries are fed up with the Palestinians. It's not much more complicated than that. They want to pursue their own interests, particularly with regard to Washington, relations with the United States, which is still an important regional player, and Israel, for reasons we've already discussed. The difficulty is, I think, that evidence from opinion polls point to continued popular support across the Arab states and the Muslim states for the Palestinians. I think to some extent it's a generational thing too. The older generation, for example, the founder of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, was Sheikh Zayed. He was a well-known supporter of the Palestinian cause, but his own son, Mohammed bin Zayed, has conducted this agreement over the heads and to the fury of the Palestinians. And of course, none of these countries are remotely approaching a democratic, accountable political systems.
So it's the fact that the older generation felt more kinship with the Palestinians. The younger generation sees a different future and an insoluble problem, perhaps. So let me bring Giorgio in at this point, if I may, and said one of the things I read, which reflects some of what has been said on this program, is that what we've seen is a de-sovereigntization of nominally independent Arab states, which is a very long-winded way of saying they're being played by somebody else.
You know, every Arab state that is considering normalizing relations with Israel has its own unique situation. When we're talking about the UAE's decision, I think we need to understand the UAE is much more independent, wealthy, and powerful than some other Arab countries such as Bahrain. I think the UAE was really doing this based on Abu Dhabi's perception of the UAE's own national interests. When we're talking about some of the poorer Arab states, including those which depend on a lot of aid from Abu Dhabi, Mauritania is a very strong example of this. There are a lot of external pressures, as you mentioned, which are in the picture. At the same time, many of these countries are trying very hard to maintain good relations with the Trump administration. And I think if Trump is to be reelected, there will be more pressure on them to consider taking the step of formalizing relations with Israel.
A final quick one, if I may do for you, James. The whole region has changed, has it not? So what we see here is perhaps another one of those ripples from the Middle East that spreads out and affects the whole of the region and in turn the rest of the world. I
agree. Everything is changing, and the region desperately needs peace. It desperately needs statesmanship and a settlement of some kind. And I just hope that the UAE, particularly, but all parties, will actually take this as a step, not towards simply tamping down problems, but actually towards building real solutions for the long term for the region.
Well, one can only hope. Listen, thank you very much indeed, James Watt. Thank you to Giorgio Cafiero and to Ian Black. Much appreciated your time and your insightfulness on this program. From me, David Foster, thank you, wherever you happen to be, for watching this edition of Roundtable. We hope to have your company next time, pretty soon. Until then, goodbye.